Hello, and thank you for watching this Q&A for Try Harder. My name is Hanna Huang, and I'm the Executive Director of the Awesome Asian American Film Festival. Now, with great excitement, it's my pleasure to introduce Director Debbie Lum. So Debbie, I was so entranced with the film, and like the way you structure the story and found the students to focus on was just quite unique. So I kind of want to learn more, and for our audiences to learn more about how did you choose this school and what was the process of even beginning to get the permissions or to get set up to film, because I'm sure that process was quite arduous.
Yeah, well, in San Francisco, Lowell High School is an iconic high school that everyone knows about. I'm not from here, but the minute you arrive in San Francisco, you've heard about this public school. It's the oldest public high school west of the Mississippi.
Mhm.
It was established in like 1856, and it's always been sort of the school for high achieving students within the public school system. And for the longest time, it's been really this predominantly Asian American high school. And, I grew up closer to Austin than to San Francisco. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, where it was like being Asian. I mean, we had fewer Asians in Austin, I think. Like I always felt like we were the only family. We weren't really, but I mean, we were such a tiny minority that when I was really interested in a high school that's like a majority Asian American. And San Francisco also is a school where there's a really large, is a city where there's a large Asian American presence. So, I mean, it wasn't, I think it was kind of a no-brainer to film at Lowell High School, even though surprisingly it had never been done before. Like there had never been a feature length documentary about Lowell. But so what happened was we actually had heard about this program called the Lowell Science Research Program, where young high school students are doing like crazy high level science research at the #1 medical research institution in the United States, which is UCSF. And it was through that program we met the teacher in the film, Mr. Shapiro, who was just like, he's kind of like he was more than just a character in the film. He really helped us in creating this, the whole film and meeting all the students. And yeah, I don't think we could have done it without Mr. Shapiro.
He also provided a very interesting look into some of the history of what it was like Lowell in the 80s and then now, right? And that evolution. So he's almost like evolved with the change in the student body. And if anything, I would say that the students have pushed him to really up his teaching game too, because you can see in his interactions with the students, he'll say like, oh, I have to make this harder next time because Jonathan Chu, who's kind of like the star student of that graduating class, is scored, an A+ again or something like that. So that's great to hear about how involved Mr. Shapiro was throughout that process with you too. And did any of these, even though you grew up in a very different time and place, was there any semblance or nostalgia being in that high school environment again?
You know what? It's so interesting how much high school is so formative. I mean, obviously, right? But then when you're an adult and you return to high school as an adult and you relive high school and you see what kids go through today, it cannot help but, bring you back. And that's what we've heard from so many people when the film came out. It's just like, oh my God, either it was like, that is so much like my high school, or, I was struggling with really similar things, back when I went to high school, relationships with your parents, comparing yourself to your peers, just like so many ways in which we connect universally to high school. And I think that's part of also what I thought was really interesting about the story is that it is definitely an Asian American story. But this Asian American story is totally universal. It's a story where, characters like us who are Asian American are the protagonists, and that's just not a common thing, even though, and yet it's, you know, they're totally relatable and universal nonetheless.
Yeah, you had a very well-rounded kind of select students that stood out, in particular Asian American and non-Asian American. For especially for the students that were non-Asian American, how were you drawn or learned about their stories? And I thought they created a really good foil to just kind of like the trope of the high achieving Asian American student, but you brought so much like depth and well-roundedness to what else is happening in that school.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, who we once we met Rachel, we just knew we wanted to film her and follow her
Mhm.
around. And we heard her talking about her mom, and then we met her mom, and it was just, I mean, she's got such candor. Um, Yet another, you know, I mean, we met so many students at Lowell who were just amazing students, and not just that they were great at academics, but I mean, they're all really trying hard. I mean, it's not, um, I think 17 and 18-year-olds on the cusp of adulthood trying to get into college, everyone is going through incredibly pivotal time
Mhm.
in their lives. Um, and like everyone is earnestly, you know, trying their hardest. And then Shay was also, he really popped out because he
Mhm.
was the one, there were only two younger kids in that AP physics class. It was all seniors. Um, Shay and another boy who happened to be Asian American were the two juniors in that class at the time. And he just, you know, we were talking to Shane, and he was telling us about what he was going through. And it was so incredibly moving, um, that, you know, all of the kids were kids that we were rooting for ourselves, you know, and we felt like that was what made it such a, you know, um, both easy story to tell and also very powerful.
Well, especially in Shay's case, throughout the film, he deals with an eviction. He's away from the family member that cares for him, and with a family member who doesn't really take care of him well. And was there any moments during that time that, especially in documentary filmmaking, it's hard to just kind of be the bystander in film? Was there any parts or times, especially filming with kids, that you felt the need to intervene or to reach out and ask administrators or others for them to get more support?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Shay had really strong support from family members, just not his
Mhm.
father who he's living with. And so, and he also had mentors at Lowell High School who he could really talk to. I mean, obviously, I think any young person needs someone, and you know, a family member, a friend, and
Mhm.
you know, an adult. And often, I think kids can, um, especially at that age, it's easy for them to hide things, I think, from
Mhm.
people. So I think in general, um, you know, you're kind of, I think all of the teachers, like working in a school like Lowell, or any teacher, is quite aware of that, and they probably have their feelers out. Um, I mean, we we felt like the students that we talked to were, you know, doing okay. And I think that's kind of how you feel when you watch the film. It's like actually a lot of the struggles that they're going through are really self-imposed, you know,
Mhm.
and that they just really could, um, I mean, you know, without sounding like the adult in the room who doesn't understand it and doesn't get it,
Yeah.
which is easy to sound like, they, what they really need is like a sense of, that it's going to be okay, you know, that, you know, not to be so hard on yourself, you know what I mean?
Was there a student that you felt connected to or felt like you related to a lot in particular?
Of the, you mean of the kids? We, I
Yeah,
relate
of any
to
of the
all of
kids.
them.
Yeah.
I mean, in different ways, you know. Um, I mean, I think I was a little bit like Rachel when I
Mhm.
was a kid. I totally related to being like the odd person out, the total, a really tiny minority in a school where people are of a different ethnicity, and the kind of how you stick out and the things that happen when you stick out. Certainly I related to that. My mom is not a tiger mom, though, for the record. In our generation, people were not
Mhm.
like parents just had no
They're
idea.
too busy to be tiger moms. Um, yeah, so uh, another question I had in particular was kind of like a big case that was going on during the time you were probably filming was the affirmative action cases against Ivy League schools like Harvard and Yale, in which they Asian American students are suing and saying like affirmative action was detrimental to them or racist against them in a way, because it put a quota on how many Asians could get into these Ivy League type of schools. Did you discuss this with any of the students? Were they aware of what this case meant in particular? Because we had a very similar case in Texas at the University of Texas, where a lot of this actually stems from, and it was with a white student. And then afterwards, the same lawyer took those cases and found Asian American clients to file the suits against, Harvard, Yale, and some other Ivies.
Yeah. Well, our film is not about that case.
Mhm.
And although it was going on in the background, it was a little bit before the case actually um, was decided upon. And I think the students that we talked to, they really felt like it didn't, in a weird way, it didn't have that much to do, or didn't have an impact
Mhm.
on what they were going to do in school. I mean, I do think that Asian Americans, the kids that we talk to, and so many Asian Americans have this sense that um, if you check the box that you're Asian American, that it is a count against you. And that's
Mhm.
like a perceived feeling. And it was something that I wanted to investigate to understand what the impact of that is on a young person's identity, that they feel like, um, you know, like um, their own identity is going to be, um, it's sort of like, I think Alvin expresses some of those things in the film,
Mhm.
that it makes you, whatever it is, like ashamed of who you are, or wish that you could be somebody else. And this is kind of a problem. I don't think it's only for Asian American students. I think it's a teenage kind of feeling at times. But I did talk to students about it, and a lot of them would say that they felt like they supported affirmative action, even though they felt like it wasn't fair. Even not affirmative action, even though they felt, let me restate that because I know it can be a really contested issue,
Mhm.
but they supported it. A lot of the students that I talked to supported affirmative action, but even though they felt like the college application process wasn't exactly fair. But that is something that all students feel. I don't think Asian American students are the only ones that feel that it's not fair. I mean, like we talked
Interesting.
to
Yeah.
kids, you can see them in the library, the white kids who said, there's a dartboard and they just throw
Mhm.
the dart, and whoever they choose is going to be the one who gets it. It's not exactly, a lot of it is luck today, just because they couldn't figure out what the metrics were for for getting for getting in.
Well, for Rachel, it kind of came up. Her race came up, where she had a classmate tell her, "Oh, it's maybe because you're black or you're part black." And I can't remember what scene it was exactly, but then she also was one of the few students to get into an Ivy. Is that right?
Well, I mean, of the group that we followed, I mean,
Mhm.
obviously Shay got into
Oh, yes.
Stanford, and
Mhm.
then you know she got into Cornell and Brown, and people would, I think she that's kind of what happens is like when there's no room to talk about what's going on and to
Mhm.
process it, that, the kind of raw emotions come out. And obviously, I bet that kid who said that regretted saying that,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
just for the record, that kid was not an Asian kid who
Mhm.
said that. And I think people often sort of assume that, or especially the media loves to kind of point out, well, at a predominantly Asian American high school, there's racism. But, there's racism at every single high school in America. Um, and that's just something that we're trying to deal with as a nation, right?
Yeah.
Um,
It's very interesting to me though for a school that's kind of known to not be to not have a lot of students go into IVs, and that being a goal of so many of the students, that people are still so desperate to have their kids go to this school. Was that something that you and the crew talked about and the production team talked about,
you mean desperate to go to an Ivy, or desperate
or
to go?
desperate to attend this high school because they know it's high achieving?
Well,
Mhm.
I mean, I think that bottom line, there's parents are sending their kids to Lowell High School because they get a great education at the end of 4 years there, and it's a public school, and they have access to that. And you know, annually, 40 to 50% of the students that go to Lowell High School are low income students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. So these are people who don't necessarily have the resources to go to a fancy private school that's going to up their chances of getting into an Ivy or so-called Ivy elite, a so-called elite college. I think that is more of there's a necessity, there's a need for it.
Mhm.
So I don't, I think that it's interesting that there's so much pressure on kids across the board to apply to the top school just for rankings, when there's so many amazing colleges out there.
Yeah.
I mean, I think UT Austin is like a great example of a great college
Mhm.
where it's like the admissions criteria are so different. It's an incredible education. Amazing people have gone to the school, right?
Yeah,
Um, it's
definitely.
just going to be a different experience. But people really, it's like this, I think, social media and over marketing from colleges who are, not at all innocent in this whole system, creates this, really um, crazy frenzy around success and failure and elite college acceptance. But just for the record, Lowell High School does, I mean, a lot of students do get into the
Yeah.
so-called
Mhm.
highly ranked schools. Um, they just, the amount of students that don't get in, that get in, it has probably come down as it has everywhere in every single high school. And the reality that Lowell High School was a public school for high achieving students, which used to go right into other high achieving public colleges like UC Berkeley, that has changed. That really has changed, I think, the landscape for these
It's
kids.
interesting. Yeah. So we talked a little about this before, but right now in Texas, we've had kind of a contentious Texas legislature session where one of the bills that was up was Bill 3979, saying that critical race theory is anti-white, anti-Christian, and anti-American, and trying to remove those elements from schools and limit the ability of teachers to teach about critical race theory and ethnic studies components that go along with it. So I wanted to ask, in terms of Lowell, we saw a lot of like the STEM courses, some fine arts, like the more traditional fine arts, I would say, of like violin playing and other things like that. But do you know if there is any Asian American studies programs, or how that's folded in, especially for a school with such a high Asian American population?
Yeah, I mean, in California and somewhat a lot of Western states, it is a law that ethnic studies is meant to be implemented in high schools. I think what happens is that um, having it be required and having it actually be implemented are often very different. So technically,
Mhm.
they do have ethnic studies at Lowell. Did we see any students taking ethnic studies? Not really. And like often when you say ethnic studies, does it even include AAPI, Asian American Studies? It doesn't always. So I think that's one of the things we were talking about
Mhm.
before off camera, is that as the film comes out, and we've been so fortunate to have such a wide, to really reach a lot of people, is that we are doing an impact campaign to try to recenter students at the heart of college admissions. And two things that we're really focusing on are mental health, as well as diversity. And ethnic studies in high schools is something that we really believe is um, very related to college admissions. And you can see,
Yeah.
our film takes you through the sort of will they make it, that kind of very dramatic journey of, are they going to get into their dream college? But in the background, what's happening is that, like, the kids who are, let's say they're Asian American, and they're maybe having a hard time with holistic admissions criteria for getting into like these elite schools like Harvard and Stanford. Often the component that that's not being served is their identity, their history,
Yeah.
and how can they write a personal statement that is going to appeal to college admissions officers when they don't know their own history. And it's really important, I think, the whole piece of inclusion doesn't mean that, like, if you're a minority, that you it's okay for you to be part of the main stage, as long as you stand off over to the side right here. I mean, I don't think that's what people want in this country, where we're all you know we're all equal, you know, and we should have equal access to our history and our stories.
That's
Does that
great to
make
know
sense?
about that impact campaign coming up, and we'll definitely keep an eye out for it. And kind of just ending on a lighter note, but I think everyone has this question of like, how come you never followed Jonathan Chu kind of as like one of the main characters? I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, it's so funny because we kind of all knew like what would happen. It's like what Ian said in the
Mhm.
film. It's like he knew what would happen to Jonathan Chu, and we sort of knew that too as filmmakers. And we figured there wouldn't be quite the same um, mystery. But the part that was mysterious and was really interesting was the way the students idolized him. And I think it's something that he doesn't particularly enjoy or agree with, because he is a real person. And one of these days we'll bring him along so he can actually speak to more audiences. But he's just like, I mean, I think he was quite humble about the whole situation.
Mhm.
Um, and probably not quite as aware about how academically gifted he really is. But he also said something really interesting, which was, he said, which it wasn't in the film, but he said, I've done really well in high school, and like maybe I won, like you can see me as like the person who won this high school contest, but like who's to say, like, in the next 5 years or 10 years or whatever, that it's going to be that easy for me. I mean, it's like everybody,
Oh
it's
wow.
not necessarily, you know what I mean? Like he was
Yeah.
very wise about that, where I was like, well, that's why you're.
That's why you're Jonathan Chu.
But still, I think that is
Yeah.
true, is that like, as
Mhm.
like, this is what I always say to, it's like part of our campaign is that, and we're doing it now, we're reaching out to schools, and we've developed discussion guides, and we're hoping that people who want to see the film will bring it to their community and have a conversation about what is the meaning of all the pressure, and what do you want to get out of college? Is it about rankings, or is it about finding the
Mhm.
right fit, the right school for you? But what I always tell parents is like, you know, the it's like, it isn't, you can't really force your kid to get into the college that your kid needs to get into. Like, that's their journey, you know. And if you look at like the results, just like from an outsider, it's often the students who aren't getting pushed by their parents. They
Yeah,
just,
there was a lot of self-motivated pushing in this film.
yeah.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much for this conversation today. And it was great learning a little bit more about the film.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. And I hope audiences enjoy it.